Hello, my name is Tia, also known as Costume Fiend, because I'm both evil and excessively fond of dressing up. I am admittedly not as much of a vampire girly as I used to be. Almost ironically, when Twilight came out when I was like a teenager, it actually kind of turned me off to vampires for a while. And not because of the romance or the sparkling. I mean, like as a teen, I enjoyed Ellen Schreiber's Vampire Kisses series, but more so because it kind of actually made having a vampire boyfriend seem more annoying than gothic and romantic. Shortly after that, I discovered a book called Solace and have been a werewolf gal ever since. However, in recent years, vampire stuff has definitely gotten my attention again. So, since there are quite a few options for media that I like, and for vampiric lore in general, I think I'm gonna have to break this up. For this, I'm gonna focus on the original Fright Night movie and its sequel, What We Do in the Shadows, just the film, not the show, and Carmilla. I've seen the Fright Night remake with David Tennant, but it's been a while, and I'd have to rewatch it before I say anything definitive. I'm also holding off on What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series, because I feel like I have a separate idea for how to approach that. As for Carmilla, I've never actually read the original novel story. It's pretty short, I think, but I do plan on listening to the audiobook version. But I've seen the web series as well as the movie The Vampire Lovers, and actually, yeah, I've seen the web series film too. So that's what I'll be using as reference. The first Fright Night came out in 1985, and I believe I watched it for the first time in college on Netflix. It was directed by Tom Holland, not the Spider Man one, and it starred Chris Sarandon as the vampire Jerry Dandridge. I previously only knew Chris Sarandon, I think, from like The Princess Bride and an episode of Psych, but as vampires in fictions go, I think he played the part pretty well. The main character, Charlie, feels pretty standard for 80s movie protagonists of the time. His initial motivation is pretty much that he's a teenage boy and he wants to take the next step with his girlfriend. The whole seductive vampire moves in next door and puts a bit of damper on that, especially since the vampires lost love and Charlie's girlfriend Amy could be twins. It's a bit of a cliche at this point, but I suppose in the 80s that idea was still somewhat fresh. The movie's biggest strengths for me were its special effects, which were done by some of the people who worked on Ghostbusters the year before, and I did like some of the ways they approached vampire lore. There was the standard stuff like lack of reflection, weakness to sunlight, and wooden stakes. I appreciated how the holy water and the religious symbols didn't really work unless there was genuine belief behind their use, because that obviously raises the stakes a bit, no pun intended, since that means like just anyone with a cross isn't necessarily safe. Jerry's roommate slash familiar also didn't appear to be a human or a vampire, but a separate creature. Like, spoilers, but he turns into like goo and sand when he's killed, so you can take that however you want, I guess, since the movie doesn't explain. Not that it really needed to, that didn't really bother me, but definitely interesting. Also, it was apparently Chris Sarandon's idea to show Jerry constantly eating fruit. To use his quote directly, Jerry ate all kinds of fruit because it was just sort of something I discovered by searching it, that most bats are not blood sucking, but they're fruit bats. And I thought, well, maybe somewhere in Jerry's genealogy there's a fruit bat in him, so that's why I did that. I like the idea of that because it's fun when people use like nature to expand on their supernatural creatures' lore. And since whether or not vampires can eat varies by source material, this puts Fright Night in the they do category. Other than that, I'd probably say the character Peter Vincent was probably my favorite part of the movie. I like that he goes from just a guy who plays a vampire hunter on TV who has no actual like belief in the supernatural to then having that supernatural experience and walking away with a newfound energy for a show. Moving on to the sequel, which came out in 1988 and was directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. I'm going to be honest, as far as fans of the Fright Night movies go, I have no idea about people's personal rankings or thoughts, but for me, Fright Night 2 was my favorite, and honestly, I think it's a bit more fun to watch. Charlie is back as the main character, but this time it focuses on Jerry's sister Regine attempting to get revenge on behalf of her brother. Regine is played by Julie Carmen, and yeah, she's pretty much the perfect femme fatale, which for me would have been fine enough on its own, but to make it even better, she comes with her own crew. I would honestly have loved to see so much more of them than what we got. Regine and her flunkies were pretty much what puts the movie higher up in the rankings for me. We've got her familiar bodyguard type guy, Bosworth, who, like Jerry's roommate, isn't a human or a vampire. We later see that he's pretty much made of bugs like the Oogie Boogie Man from The Nightmare Before Christmas. This possibly explains why he's seen snacking on insects throughout the movie, which, again, kind of just a fun, weird little thing that makes it seem like they're all different characters and not just all the same kind of cliche. Then we've got her wild card Louis, who is also a vampire, but he seems to be able to turn into a wolf like Dracula. I feel like that trait's often downplayed since we associate turning into a wolf solely with werewolves. And finally, last but not least, the very iconic, considering they have such a small amount of screen time, Belle, who is giving us the very best of the 80s in terms of hair, makeup, and fashion. Did they have to stalk their prey in roller skates? No. But did they? Hell yes. And it was awesome. I just love them. Also, since I brought up Twilight earlier, I feel like it's worth noting that before they had their vampire baseball game sequence, Regine's Peeps had a bowling sequence that does absolutely nothing for the plot, but was also extremely necessary for my mental health. It is truly sad to see them all go one by one in true vampire movie fashion. That being said, even though the antagonists are the highlight of the movie for me, I actually do like Charlie a little bit more in this one. He's still kind of, ultimately the same guy, and he still has kind of a one-track mind with regards to the ladies, but he does feel like he matured more in some ways. Plus, major spoiler alert, but the plot twist that the therapist he was seeing, who made him believe he'd imagined the first movie, was actually a vampire too, was pretty nuts. The therapist's death sequence with Charlie's new college girlfriend was also kind of funny. I think they utilized Peter Vincent pretty well too, with him being more of the believer in the beginning and having to deal with the brainwashed Charlie's skepticism. I think the sequel is still available for free on YouTube, so I'll try to remember to link it to it if that's the case. I got super fortunate and was able to find a DVD copy from a small video store in California, aptly named the Vermont Movie Store. I wish I had a smoother way to transition into talking about what we do in the shadows, but I don't, so let's just get into it. While Fright Night 2 had some of my favorite original vampire characters, What We Do in the Shadows plays on vampire archetypes from the past and manages to create likable characters that stand on its own. There's Peter, who's pretty much designed to look like the vampire in Nosferatu, and it's implied he's the one who bit the other roommates. I actually can't remember if Peter's name is a reference to Fright Night, especially since Peter Vincent's name in Fright Night is actually a reference to Peter Cushing and Vincent Price. After Peter, we have Viago, who's a bit of a dandy, and then there's my personal favorite, Vladislav, who is quite obviously a play on Vlad the Impaler, who was the real man that Dracula was inspired by. And the last of the original crew was Deacon, who considers himself to be the young rebel type, like, think Lost Boys. The newest vampire, Nick, is the one that introduces them all to the modern era, as well as to his friend Stu, who they all pretty much love instantly and vow not to eat. Since the movie's in the style of a mockumentary and was pretty much crowdfunded on Kickstarter, it does kind of deserve its props for what it manages to pull off for that alone. The costuming and practical effects / creative camera angles are some of the highlights, as well as all the performances. I also enjoyed the style of humor overall and definitely quote this movie a lot because it borrows a lot from and was inspired by a lot of other vampire media. I don't think there's anything new that it adds from a lore perspective for vampires, but I do like how they played with some of the tropes. For example, we have Viago being 379, but he looks like, he's in his 30s, and his human girlfriend, who he changes into a vampire at the end of the movie, is like in her 90s, so obviously she looks like the older one to outside perspectives. And speaking of age gaps and playing that trope completely straight, nailed that transition. I'm going to move on to Carmilla and wrap shit up. The original Carmilla story actually predates Dracula, despite the fact that Dracula is often treated like the first major piece of vampire fiction. Like Dracula, the original Carmilla is rather dated from what I know, and it does feature lesbianism in concept, but there's obviously a predatory flavor to it, and there's also some fun racism. The movie The Vampire Lovers, which came out in 1970, doesn't really get into race very much, but it does somewhat play the rest straight. I've only watched it once though, so I'd have to rewatch it to get an even stronger, opinion on that. But like with the original Carmilla, considering it touches on lesbian themes at all, that does kind of make it noteworthy. The Carmilla web series, which started in 2014, modernizes everything. Well, for 2014. And actually portrays lesbians and queer people in a more positive light. I believe there's non-binary representation. It was pretty much, that's pretty much one of its big selling points. It also connected some of its vampire lore to Sumerian mythology, which was an interesting take. Considering how old vampires can be, I've noticed that media tends to depict extremely old vampires as being from ancient cultures, like how I think Anne Rice connected her older or original vampires to ancient Egypt. In the original book, I don't think Carmilla's maker was given much attention. She has a mother figure, but after she drops Carmilla off, I think she kind of just leaves the narrative. And Carmilla's feeding was related directly to her being a vampire rather than there being any connections to Inanna or Ishtar and any eldritch being that demanded young ladies as sacrifices. The web series also attempts to do right by Carmilla's adopted black sister to somewhat mixed results. The actress that played her, though, was gorgeous and brought nuances there that I think amplified the writing. It's actually been a while since I've revisited the series, so maybe I'll do that at some point to see how it feels watching it about a decade later. Also, I think for next week, I'm going to talk about the whole Dracula's fictional children phenomenon. And then after that, I think I might take the next week off. I think I'm liking doing the weekly Sunday evening thing, but this last week was really really tiring. See, but anyway, that's not super relevant right now. So other than that, leave a like if you liked, subscribe for more nerdy rambling, and as always, have a good one.